The Galactic Survival Council had a reputation to uphold, and that reputation was built on one simple principle. Nobody could survive their hunger test. Not the mighty Kraxons with their 4 stomachs. Not the photosynthetic Viridians who could literally eat sunlight. Not even the cybernetically enhanced Nexari who had replaced their digestive systems with nutrient processors. So when Marcus Chen, a perfectly ordinary human from Earth's perfectly ordinary agricultural sector, signed up for the test, the betting pools opened immediately. The question wasn't whether he'd fail. It was how spectacularly he'd fail and how long it would take. Another soft skin wants to play with the big kids, chuckled Zextar, the Kraxon administrator, his mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among his species. What's your survival experience, human? Marcus shrugged, adjusting his worn baseball cap. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. Does that count? The entire registration hall erupted in what could generously be called laughter, but sounded more like a dying space whale convention. Zextar's 4 eyes rolled independently, a neat trick that Marcus genuinely admired, though he kept that to himself. A farmer, wheezed Nix, a crystalline shard whose voice tinkled like breaking glass. They send us a dirt scratcher who probably thinks survival means knowing which end of a cow to milk. Hey now, Marcus said with a grin that was equal parts charming and infuriating. I'll have you know I can milk a cow from both ends. It's just that one end gives milk, and the other end gives you a very different kind of wet surprise. The laughter died down to confused murmurs. Apparently, Earth humor didn't translate well across species barriers. Who knew? The hunger test was beautifully simple in its cruelty. Drop a contestant on Kepler 442b, a planet that the Council had specifically chosen for being almost but not quite entirely hostile to life. The contestant would have no supplies, no tools, no shelter, and no food. They would have exactly 30 standard galactic days to not die. Most species made it about 4 days before tapping out via emergency beacon, assuming they weren't too dead to tap anything. The record holder was a Nexari war veteran named Crix, who had lasted 11 days by entering a meditative hibernation state and slowly consuming his own cybernetic components for raw materials. He'd been hailed as a survival legend right up until his liver processor failed, and he'd spent 3 weeks in intensive care. So, Mr. Dirt Scratcher, Zextar said, shoving a datapad toward Marcus. Standard waiver absolving us of responsibility when you die horribly. Standard emergency beacon for when you give up. And standard burial insurance policy, because let's be honest about your chances here. Marcus skimmed the contract with the sort of careful attention that came from reading seed catalogs and equipment warranties. Says here I can't bring any manufactured tools or processed foods. Correct. You get the clothes on your back and nothing else. What about things I make myself? Zextar's mandibles twitched. Obviously, any tools you can craft from available materials are allowed. Though good luck finding anything useful on that rock. And I can hunt and gather whatever's available? If you can find anything. Most contestants spend their time looking for edible plants and usually end up poisoning themselves by day 3. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and signed the contract with a flourish. When do we start? The transport to Kepler 442b was luxury compared to what awaited him. But Marcus spent the journey chatting with the other passengers like he was heading to a county fair instead of probable death. He asked the pilot about the ship's engines, complimented the stewardess on her scales, and somehow managed to talk a Graxian trader into teaching him basic knots using the meal service napkins. You're remarkably calm for someone about to die, observed Dr. Yilla, the mission's medical observer, her tentacles swaying with what Marcus had learned to recognize as concern. Well, Doc, I figure worry is just interest paid on trouble that may never come due. My grandpa used to say that. Your grandfather sounds wise. He was also an alcoholic who once tried to milk a bull, so take his wisdom with a grain of salt. The drop ship deposited Marcus in what the council generously called a temperate zone, but which looked more like Mars's angry cousin. Red dirt stretched in all directions, broken up by scrubby vegetation and the occasional boulder formation. The sun, slightly smaller and redder than Earth's, beat down with the enthusiasm of a passive-aggressive space heater. Last chance to reconsider, human, crackled Zextar's voice through the comm system. This isn't your backyard garden. Marcus waved at the departing ship like he was seeing off relatives after Sunday dinner. Thanks for the ride. See you in a month. The ship's engines faded into the distance, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of wind and his own breathing. He took a deep breath of thin, metallic-tasting air and rolled up his sleeves. All right, Kepler, he said to the planet at large. Let's see what you got. What Kepler 442b had, as it turned out, was a grudge against anything that wanted to stay alive. The first night nearly killed him. Not from cold, though the temperature dropped like a rock concert crowd when the opening act turns out to be polka music, but from the local wildlife's apparent belief that anything new should be thoroughly investigated with teeth. Marcus spent his first few hours gathering information instead of panicking, which already put him ahead of 90% of previous contestants. He noted that the scrubby plants grew in clusters around what looked like underground water sources. He observed that the local rodent analogs had well-worn trails between the water sources and certain types of rocks. Most importantly, he noticed that some of the boulder formations had natural windbreaks and overhangs. The thing about farming, he told a curious six-legged creature that looked like a prairie dog crossed with a bad dream, is that it teaches you to work with what you have, instead of complaining about what you don't have. The creature chittered and ran away, possibly because it recognized superior predator instincts, or possibly because Marcus smelled like 3 days of spaceship recycled air. By day 3, when most contestants were either dead or begging for extraction, Marcus had managed to construct a shelter that was actually more comfortable than his first apartment. He'd woven together tough grass fibers to create cordage, used that cordage to lash together a frame of dead branches, and covered the whole thing with layered vegetation for insulation. The Galactic Survival Council's monitoring station buzzed with confused activity. He's actually building things, reported scanner technician Velik, her blue-furred head tilted in bewilderment. Real things. Functional things. What kind of things? Zextar demanded. Well, he started with shelter, obviously. But then he built some kind of water collection system. And now he's working on what looks like... She paused to adjust her sensors. Traps? Traps? What's he trapping? There's barely anything to hunt on that planet. That's what's weird. According to our biological surveys, the local fauna consists mainly of small burrowing creatures with minimal nutritional value. Nothing worth the energy expenditure to hunt. Zextar's 4 eyes narrowed independently, which was his equivalent of a suspicious squint. Keep watching. Marcus, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. The 6-legged prairie dog creatures, he'd started calling them gribbles, were numerous, fast, and absolutely terrible at avoiding obvious traps. He'd started with simple deadfall traps, the kind his grandfather had taught him for catching rabbits back on Earth. When those proved wildly successful, he'd graduated to snares and eventually to a complex system of funnel traps that channeled entire gribble families into holding areas. The secret, he explained to a particularly fat gribble that had wandered into his latest contraption, is understanding behavior patterns. You guys always run uphill when scared, always follow the same trails, and always investigate new smells. It's like you're asking to be caught." The Gribble squeaked indignantly. "Don't take it personally. Your species just evolved in an environment without persistence, hunters. Bad luck, really." By day 7, Marcus had a smokehouse constructed from clay and stone, a dozen different trap designs in operation, and enough preserved gribble meat to feed a small army. He'd also discovered that certain roots, when properly prepared, made an acceptable starch to go with his protein windfall. The monitoring station was in chaos. He's created fire. Velik reported in, a tone usually reserved for announcing natural disasters. "Lots of species can make fire." Zextar replied dismissively. "Not like this. He's using it for food preservation. He's smoking meat." "Impossible. The local fauna doesn't provide enough calories to justify the energy expenditure for hunting, let alone preservation." "Sir, you need to see this." Zextar reluctantly hovered over to Velik's monitor. The image showed Marcus tending to what could only be described as an industrial-scale meat processing operation. Dozens of gribbles hung from improvised smoking racks, while Marcus worked on preparing more trap sites. "How many of those creatures has he caught?" "According to my count, approximately 347. "That's impossible. Our surveys indicated a sparse population barely capable of sustaining itself." Dr. Yilla's tentacles writhed with what Marcus would have recognized as academic excitement. "He's not hunting randomly. Look at his trap placement. He's targeting specific age groups and family units to maximize population recovery while ensuring steady harvesting rates. It's sustainable predation." "Sustainable what now?" "He's farming them. Not just hunting, farming. He's managing the population like a resource." Back on Kepler 442b, Marcus was indeed treating the gribble population like the renewable resource it had always been, waiting for someone smart enough to figure that out. He'd mapped their territorial ranges, identified their breeding cycles, and calculated sustainable harvesting quotas that would ensure long-term food security. "The thing about farming," he told his latest batch of trapped gribbles, "is that it's not about taking everything you can get right now. It's about making sure you can keep taking what you need for as long as you need it." By day 14, he'd expanded operations to include what could only be called agriculture. The edible roots, he'd discovered, could be cultivated if you knew what you were doing. He'd cleared small plots near his water sources and begun transplanting the most productive varieties. "He's terraforming," breathed Dr. Yilla, watching Marcus construct irrigation channels from his limitless supply of gribble leather and sinew. "On a small scale, but he's actually improving the local ecosystem." "For what purpose?" Zextar demanded. "Long-term habitation, I would assume. He's planning to stay." "Nobody plans to stay on Kepler 442b. It's a survival test, not a colonization effort." "Has anyone told the human that?" They had not, as it turned out, told the human that. Marcus was operating under the assumption that 30 days was just the minimum requirement, and he was already planning for year-round residency. He'd identified seasonal patterns, calculated resource renewal rates, and begun construction on what could only be described as a permanent settlement. The betting pools had closed after day 10 when it became obvious that Marcus wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The conversation in the monitoring station had shifted from "when will he quit" to "is he actually going to complete the full 30 days?" to "should we be concerned that he seems to be establishing a colony?" By day 20, Marcus had achieved something that no previous contestant had even attempted. He was gaining weight. His gribble and root diet, supplemented by various edible plants he'd identified through careful testing, was not only keeping him alive, but actively improving his physical condition. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Yilla reported during the daily briefing. "All previous contestants showed progressive deterioration from day one. This human is showing measurable improvement in muscle mass, cardiovascular health, and psychological stability." Psychological stability. Zextar's mandibles clicked nervously. He appears to be happier now than when he started. This was, in fact, entirely accurate. Marcus had spent the last 15 years working someone else's land, growing someone else's crops, and answering to someone else's schedule. For the first time in his adult life, he was working for himself, on his own schedule, with immediate and tangible results for every effort expended. "This is the best vacation I've had in years," he told a family of gribbles that had taken up residence near his settlement. He'd stopped trapping the ones that hung around his living area, finding them useful for pest control and early warning of predators. "No boss, no deadlines, no paperwork. Just good honest work and results I can see." The gribbles chittered agreement, or possibly disagreement. Marcus had learned to interpret most of their vocalizations, but some remained ambiguous. By day 25, the monitoring station was receiving inquiries from xenobiologists, agricultural specialists, and colonial development agencies. Word had gotten out that a human had not only survived the hunger test, but had essentially turned an allegedly barren planet into productive farmland. "The applications are piling up," Velik reported. "Everybody wants to study his methods." "His methods are irrelevant," Zextar insisted, though his tone lacked its previous conviction. "The test ends in 5 days. He'll be extracted, and that will be the end of it." "Sir, about the extraction." "What about it?" "He hasn't activated his emergency beacon." "Of course not." "The test isn't over." "No, sir." "I mean, he's dismantled his emergency beacon. He used the components to build some kind of water purification system." Zextar's 4 eyes focused on Velik with laser precision. "He did what?" "Apparently, he needed the filtration mesh for processing root starch. He's converted the signal generator into some kind of food dehydrator. Very ingenious, actually." "How are we supposed to extract him without the beacon?" "I suppose we'll have to land a ship and ask him if he wants to leave." This conversation was repeated, with increasing volume and decreasing civility, several times over the next 4 days. By day 29, the monitoring station was in full panic mode. Marcus had not only survived the test, but had created a thriving homestead that was attracting interest from across the galaxy. Worse, he showed no signs of wanting to leave. On day 30, the extraction ship landed to find Marcus waiting for them with a picnic spread that would have impressed a 5-star restaurant. Grilled gribble with root vegetables, various local fruits he'd discovered and cultivated, and what appeared to be some kind of fermented beverage made from plant sugars. "Welcome to New Iowa," Marcus called out cheerfully as Zextar emerged from the ship. "I was hoping you'd make it back for the harvest celebration." "Harvest celebration?" Zextar's voice cracked slightly. "First successful crop cycle. The root vegetables came in better than expected, and I've got 3 new varieties of fruit trees that should be productive by next season." Marcus gestured toward his expanded settlement, which now covered several acres and included multiple buildings, cultivation areas, and what looked suspiciously like the beginnings of an industrial complex. "Mr. Chen?" Dr. Yilla said gently, her tentacles weaving nervous patterns. "The test is over. You've completed the 30-day survival requirement." "Oh, I know. Thanks for that, by the way. It gave me the kick in the pants I needed to finally try something new." Marcus grinned and took a swig of his homemade beverage. I've been thinking about expanding operations. This planet has incredible potential once you understand the ecosystem dynamics. You want to stay? Zextar asked incredulously. Why wouldn't I? I've got sustainable food production, reliable water sources, adequate shelter, and the most beautiful sunsets I've ever seen. Plus, the Gribbles are actually pretty good company once you get to know them. As if summoned, a fat Gribble waddled over and accepted a piece of fruit from Marcus's hand. That's a wild animal, Zextar pointed out. That's Gerald. He's got a territory dispute with the family that lives under the storage shed. But he's working it out. Aren't you, buddy? Gerald chittered and waddled back toward the settlement. The extraction team spent 3 hours trying to convince Marcus to return to civilization. They offered him money, fame, academic positions, and consulting contracts. Marcus listened politely, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately declined everything. I appreciate the offers, he said, but I've got crops to tend and a planet to explore. Besides, Gerald's expecting his first litter next month, and I promised I'd help with the birthing shelter. You're going to deliver alien babies? Dr. Yilla asked faintly. Somebody has to. Gerald's a single father, and the other males in his territory aren't exactly supportive. It takes a village, you know? In the end, they left him there with a promise to return in 6 months to check on his progress. The Galactic Survival Council faced an unprecedented situation. Their impossible test had been not just passed, but completely redefined by someone who treated it like a homesteading opportunity. The final report, when it was eventually filed, broke records for brevity and confusion. Subject Marcus Chen successfully completed the hunger test. Requirements in 30 standard days. Subject declined extraction and has established permanent residence on Kepler 442b. Recommend reclassifying planet from survival test location to agricultural development site. Also recommend psychological evaluation of test design committee, as our definition of barely habitable may need revision. 6 months later, when the check-in ship arrived, they found Marcus waiting at a proper landing pad next to a settlement that qualified as a small town. He'd been joined by 17 other humans who'd heard about his success and wanted to try their hand at frontier agriculture. Welcome to New Iowa, Marcus called out, exactly as he had 6 months earlier. Population 18 and growing. We've got fresh vegetables, locally raised meat, and the galaxy's first successful Gribble domestication program. Gerald's great-great-grandchildren are producing milk, if you can believe that. The check-in team could, in fact, believe that, because they could see the small herd of milk-producing Gribbles being tended by human children who treated the whole situation like the most normal thing in the universe. Mr. Chen, the team leader said weakly, what have you done? Marcus grinned, adjusted his worn baseball cap, and gestured toward the thriving settlement that had grown around his original homestead. I turned a survival test into a survival success story. The council said nobody could last the hunger test, but they never specified what we were supposed to be hungry for. We meant food, the team leader protested. I know. But I was hungry for something bigger than just not dying. I was hungry for a place to call home, work that mattered, and a future I could build with my own hands. Marcus paused to wave at Gerald, who was now approximately the size of a small cow and wearing what appeared to be a hand-knitted sweater. Turns out this planet was hungry for the same thing. The final entry in Marcus Chen's file read simply, Test subject has redefined success parameters. Recommend updating test protocols to account for human tendency to treat survival situations as optimization challenges. Also recommend Gerald for diplomatic immunity. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Survival Council, a notice was quietly issued that the hunger test would be suspended indefinitely, pending a review of what exactly they had been testing for in the first place. After all, it's hard to maintain a reputation for impossibility when someone keeps treating your impossible tests like interesting weekend projects. The betting pools, meanwhile, had reopened with entirely new parameters. The question was no longer whether humans could survive the Council's tests, but whether the Council's tests could survive humans. Early indicators suggested the tests were in serious trouble.